trash cans this year.
Hey, wait a minute. My Little League team is the Rangers, and I would match them up with the current Texas Rangers. Just saying.
Wow. Hey guys, we're now live.
We are definitely live, and we are definitely Texans, and we'd like to welcome everybody to this week's Facebook Live, October 14th, 2020. We want to look at the current situations of diversity amongst police forces, including the various openings for police chiefs and how the search gets conducted, what type of requisites, biases, just the selection process and what is considered. And then also we have stumbled upon an issue of police unions. We wanted to do this because when we get to specifics when it comes to cases in Texas regarding interfaces with law enforcement in scenarios that are high profile, we want to make sure that we have vetted those so we can have a discussion that is very pointed to fact, not speculation or fiction. So with that, Nikki and Doug were having an offline conversation prior to Councilman Dallas team showed up. Our chair, Rudy Matera of the African-American lawyer section of the state bar. He is pro North Texas only, unless it's long-term related. It has come to that. We're in the middle of football season and the like. We cannot help ourselves, but we're honest and open about who we are. So with that, we get to the discussion. If we'd like to start with the police unions and then discuss some of the criteria for the openings of police chiefs in the major metropolitan areas in Texas. Nikki.
Actually, Steve, if you don't mind, before we even get there, excuse me, sorry about that. I do not have COVID. But they have to put that out there whenever you cough or sneeze. One of the things that has definitely been prevalent, especially in this year, is that we've seen the exit of a lot of police chiefs in metropolitan areas. Dallas, Fort Worth, and Arlington are all three actually looking for a police chief for positions right now to fill their police chief. There was a situation in Converse, Texas, where that police chief is actually stepping down. And so there are some more all across the states. And what it showed specific to Texas, based on information that was provided by T. Cole and some other reporting forces, is that there's still a diversity when you look at the makeup of the officers and the population in which they're serving as far as diversity. That could be minority, that could be women, that could be Latinos, it could be African Americans. Just in general, there seems to be a disparity gap. And what we were saying prior to the call is during my research, they actually said that Houston was one of the cities that, based on the trends from 2016 to now, has been pretty consistent with the trend in their police force matching how their community is growing, which seems to be a lot of areas where other communities struggle. Like, for example, in Waco, they said that 80% of the police officers, and this is based on the report that I had, were Caucasian, but they only make up under 45% of the population, right? And so when you have those kind of disparity gaps, it's interesting to start to look at how police or peace officers are being recruited. Are there any specific initiatives to diversity when there is recruitment? And how has Houston been able to keep up with that trend? What are some of the secrets and things that you have done there? And I think, Doug, you were sharing with us that the police union has actually been very helpful in kind of navigating those waters. So if you want to kind of talk about that, I think that helps us lay the groundwork of why we were having that conversation.
Yes, ma'am. Back in 98, when we did our first contract, the city was trying to figure out how can we do a more diverse background or a more diverse department. So we sit down with the city and we come up with the way currently that any officer gets hired is they have to go take a civil service exam somewhere. So let's say Waco is going to hire police officers. They give a civil service exam. The top, however many people that they have spots for, on that civil service exam, go to the police academy. So sometimes we have issues with, minorities not doing as well on these tests. So they get bumped to the bottom of the list. So if they're just taking the top and they're just taking, all white guys, well, that's all they have spots for. That's who the top 10 on the test were. That's who they take. We want to do it a little differently. So what we did is we said, look, through our meet confer contract, we will move the civil service test to the end, to the last 2 weeks of the academy is when you take the civil service test in Houston. So the department can hire whoever they want. If they want a whole group of minorities, a whole group of women, whatever they want, they can hire into the academy class, run it through, and then they pass civil service at the end of the academy. So that allows us to have a much more diverse base than any other group, probably in the nation, if you ask me. And that was all because of our contract. And we would like to, just keep that going. Now, when it comes to our rank structure, we have a more diverse rank structure than any others because of the way the test, and then we have assessment component. And they cannot go in there and say, hey, look, we want to promote so many African Americans. It doesn't work like that. But the top of the top are the ones that they pick through the assessment process and through testing. So we do have a much more diverse command staff, commanders, all the way across the board. We have a much more diverse department than probably anybody else.
I want to point out something and obviously Doug is a huge asset here because he's with Houston, and Houston's got their own separate set of rules, the way they do things, and it's a lot of great stuff going on in Houston. With regard to the rest of the state, Waco and whoever, it's not just a matter of test scores; it's a matter of who's applying to take the test. And, I was interviewed several years ago by a reporter from South Texas because they were talking about two different departments that are civil service that had not hired a female in like 7 or 8 years, neither one of them. And, the reporter was asking, why is that? And I said, first of all, you have to understand there's fewer women that apply for jobs in law enforcement. She asked me if I had any idea why. And my gut feeling is it's because women are smarter than men and they pick better careers than we do. But,
True.
But there's, 50% of our population is female, but only 10% of our cops across the country and across the state of Texas are female. There's something that happens at some point where females decide against law enforcement as a career option earlier on than that. So in order to try to bridge that gap, the recruiting has to start not at the testing level, it has to start at the application level. And I think that's where Houston has been able to go out and actively recruit people to come in through their process because they don't worry about that testing level anymore. They're actively recruiting in their communities, trying to get, a more representative workforce. I'll also point out, by the way, across the state of Texas, again, 10% of our cops are female, only about 11% are African-American.
Yeah, that's so.
But our population's only about 13 or 14% African-American as well. So on a statewide basis, the numbers aren't really off that far. As far as Hispanics and Latinos, I think it's actually statewide, it's about 35%, and law enforcement is 25, 26%. And those could be dated numbers. I may be thinking about stuff from a couple of years ago, but I do think that it's a recruiting thing, and most departments don't have a recruiting budget at all. They just simply sit back and wait for people to apply. And the way it's done under civil service is you fill out a card that says, I'm interested, okay? And then they send you a notice when they're going to give the civil service exam. Most departments, I don't think, ask on that card for a person's gender or their ethnicity or their race. As a matter of fact, they may be touching on legal issues if they do ask that question. So when it comes to whoever's actually putting in a card of interest, those are the people that get the notice to show up for the test.
Well, Kevin, I was going to point out, so before I got in city council, I was one of the commissioners for our ESD, which Emergency Service District, for those who are watching. Travis County ESD number 2, which is your local fire department. And Houston knows all too well about ESDs and how many you have all over their proliferation over there.
Everywhere.
But one of the things that I had spoken about is that since about 78% of all calls now are now non-fire-based calls, they're emergency calls. You know, I thought, well, okay, then why aren't we having more females actually involved in, you know, being firefighters? And, you know, what the chief told me was like, well, you know, Commissioner, one of our biggest issues was that you have bigger cities who are offering, hiring these salaries, and they're going over to the other cities to do this. And, you know, in general, there's such a finite amount of females who are interested in becoming firefighters in the first place that therefore, you know, the few that we have are like unicorns, and we're trying, you know, and you're trying to get them from that. So, you know, one of the things I proposed and we came up with that great data for, and we got to execute, was to have a firefighter academy starting in the high school. So you had high school seniors, you know, here in Pflugerville through, you know, Pflugerville ISD, who in fact, you know, if they had any interest in becoming firefighters, they're able to go through the academy their senior year, and they got the applicable training that would go from there as well. And we hired somebody who would actually go ahead and be able to do the certification when they graduate. So not only did they get the training their senior year, but the next year they would be able to get the training, get the certification.
Which
And
would
then
be
in fact,
great.
we can hire those people locally with that. And so it gets interesting, you know, and I've seen the constable's office. I think some police departments too, is the Explorer programs and everything else from there as well regarding police officers. Getting them involved, getting them interested, just like you said, at an early level, and then and then what's even better is you can keep them where you're at. So, hey, listen, okay, you're doing a good job here, and you have openings, you're able to get them trained and ready to go, and they stay in their local towns because they know their local towns. That's, I think, would be really helpful, because that's another thing we often hear about law enforcement, right? It's like, wait, you don't live here. Do you really care about our city and the people, men and women who actually run through these areas?
Well, there's also the gap period there, because between high school and 21, which is what the age you have to be to get certified as a peace officer, there's that 3-year window. You have to keep them interested. You have to stay in touch with them. So there had to be some sort of an entry level program. They have to be, you know, like I was hired on when I was 19, but I was hired on as a dispatcher / jailer, and then took the civil service exam once I got close to my 21st birthday. I don't know that there's that much opportunity for that. So that, I think, even the programs that we do have, the Explorer programs, a lot of those folks during that 3-year window, they find other careers. They, you know, they go some other direction.
Interesting.
And think about it, you could be a firefighter at 18, but you have to be 21 to be a police officer. So
And we probably ought to raise that to 25, but that's just my personal opinion.
hey, I'm in firm agreement with that.
I would agree as well.
Doug, let me ask you, because you have done well in Houston. What do you do? And you talk about Waco, but the Black population in Waco is not that high. How do you attract, you know, at 21 or 25, how would you attract these persons to get into law enforcement at that point, to even get it to some semblance of 10 to 15% on the force? And that's just the total population. That's not going to be in some of the neighborhoods, you know, that are 20 to 35% Black, you know. I mean, it's tough just because of numbers.
And it's actually kind of sad, because even in the African-American community, we have guys out there in the streets that are like, hey, I'm going to be a policeman one day. And they're basically shunned by their friends. They're like, why would you ever want to do that? Because we are vilified to some point in a lot of the minority neighborhoods. And that makes it difficult for anybody coming out of those neighborhoods that want to be a policeman, because they don't want to do it. They don't want to be, you know, they don't want their friends to say whatever about them. Because I have a lot of friends that grew up in Sunnyside, South Park. They're on a department and they lost friends because they became police officers. And that's really kind of sad. They're damn good policemen. So how to get that segment of the community engaged in wanting to do the job is going to be difficult. There's no magic bullet to walk into a neighborhood and go, hey, we want you to take over and come be police officers. We just haven't found that magic pill yet.
Well, my question for the lawyers would be this: if a department says, look, we want to make sure we assign black officers to our black neighborhoods, is the contrapositive of that going to get them in trouble if they should look? We just want to assign white officers to white neighborhoods. Aren't we walking a fine line here legally?
I think it's the intent, right? So it's the intent. If you don't give a choice, right, or you don't give, like you say, we are specifically targeting white officers, and you can only go here and you can only go there. That's where it becomes a problem. Diversity and making sure that your diversity matches your clientele, for example, or who you are servicing. There's nothing inherently wrong about that. It's the intent, and is it voluntary? Right. And so that's what you would have to look at. But I think that it's room for a mixture. I think where we kind of get into a situation is where you have people that are coming from the outside that are not familiar with the communities. And Doug, just to comment on what you said, I have several friends in law enforcement. I have family members in law enforcement. And unfortunately, when you're in a community or you have some family members that are, familiar with the law, I'll say it that way, you do become an outcast, because some of the things that you used to do, you can't do that anymore, right? And so if you're losing people, and that's where I think we need to go back to, we have a responsibility as African-American leaders, lawyers, to show young people of the opportunities that they can have in law enforcement and the changes that can be made. Those same friends that, were getting into trouble, now you can say, hey, don't do this because you're looking at this, and become a mentor. When we were in law school, we started a program called Play here at Wesleyan in Fort Worth, and it was that stood for Presenting Legal Activities to Youth. And so what we did was we went to elementary schools, we went to high schools and junior highs. We talked to the kids about different areas of law enforcement, just different areas of the law, using the state bar program now that you're 18. And we did a lot of that. And I think that there was one guy, he was a Hispanic guy out of Irving, young man that was in the Upward Bound program at UTA. And he sent us a letter like about 2 years later and said that he was going into law enforcement. Like at the time, he couldn't stand the law. He's like, I'm not doing it. But he decided to take a career in there, and I've kept in contact with him. I don't know if he's still on what he's doing now, but I remember when he was going through that process, because he was young and he was just, going to, I think, TCC at the time or some other one. He said that's what he wanted to do. But I do think these pipeline programs are important. I also think it's important to make sure that there is representation that's, I wouldn't say the exact of the population, but it needs to be close. And so a question that we get often is, how effective is it to have people coming from outside? So let's say that you're bringing in with the recruiting. If we're not able to recruit from within Texas, if we recruit outside of Texas, right, and we're recruiting for police officers that are outside, how are those efforts maintained? Is that something that is done actively? Do we recruit outside of Texas, or do we leave it specific to Texas to expand the reach?
Sometimes it's purposeful. There are departments in the state of Texas that actually go to other states and actively recruit. There's others where we've recently had an influx of officers from places like Washington State and Colorado and California that have said, you know what, I want to go to Texas. I prefer to work down there. And I will tell you this, all of this is exacerbated by the current recruiting crisis that we have going on that we've talked about before. There's fewer and fewer our young folks coming up who want to get into law enforcement. So the best recruiting tool that law enforcement currently has is to recruit from other law enforcement agencies, to basically steal officers from other departments.
Well, Kevin, wouldn't it be helpful, and Nikki, I think you may have brought out a blueprint with taking the gentleman that was going to Tarrant County. Why don't we have him speak to other young people? He's the actual person that can then turn around and say, I was you, and now I'm here. If you get the real-time examples, when I go back to my high school, I can say, I was you, and now this is where I am. It's a real-time example of someone that was in these same situations, that came from the same neighborhood, that is now doing this. It's much more encouraging to see that than I think even just, as Kevin, you say, recruiting outside of Texas or stealing, other officers, because you want to plant the seeds in those neighborhoods that then would, grow up a handful or two that want to be peace officers from that same area. And then you start getting pipelines. They do it in sports all the time. you see a particular high school going to a university, and those coaches know from the first guy that they had, now they're starting recruiting more and more from that same high school because it has a caliber of student athlete they want. I think it works the same way for law enforcement. It just takes one, and that one good example can then bring forth more from that area. I think that's how you grow from the area to get that diversity that you're looking for in that particular place than trying to piecemeal things together or grab people from outside. You grow those folks up from within, and then they're giving back and they're becoming the numbers you want to see. Because I don't think you'll find the diversity of minority officers by trying to grab people from outside. I think that's going to have to come from within the area itself.
But Steve, we're gonna have to find a way to do that on a universal basis across the state. Because Houston is the anomaly. Fort Worth is the anomaly. You know, we got 2,700 law enforcement agencies in the state. Great, you got 100 of them that have the resources, the ability to go out and actually do what you're talking about doing. You got 2,600 other law enforcement agencies that are choosing their officers from whoever's coming out of these police academies that are being taught by the local COG or the local junior college.
Right. And you got to remember too, there's not a lot of Black Americans dispersed throughout the state of Texas. So the 2,600 other law enforcement agencies, you're not going to find populations of Black Texans in those areas. It's you know, you're just not.
I don't know that I agree with you. I'm from Orange, Texas.
Well, no, but okay, but again,
I'm familiar with Orange, Texas.
that Golden Triangle area, yes, but again, if you spread out across the state of Texas, the population bases of Black Texans, Kevin, is very, they're not in Seminole, Texas. they're you know what I'm saying? They're not in Big Spring. They're not, I mean, they're not going to be in South Texas. They're just not. So to get Nikki to be honest, you're not going to find that except in highly populated areas that you do find that.
So maybe what needs to happen, and I look at this similar to, I think about not young people, but people graduated from law school that want to be prosecutors. I might go to school in Dallas. I might want to be a Dallas prosecutor, but maybe I need to go to a smaller town or somewhere else because maybe there are some opportunities there. And so you can take someone that graduated from, let's see, UT Austin or SMU, and then they may go be a prosecutor in like Orange or in these smaller towns. So I do think there's opportunity to disperse. They may not come from that specific area, but I do think recruiting efforts where you can move them across the state at a minimum. I mean, I'm not opposed to even going outside of the state of Texas, because I think that when we limit it, you're going to run into these situations. And so I don't think that it hurts. A question though that I did have in my mind before I forget, how often is the civil service test like reviewed and changed? If it's causing that much of a headache with respect to passing, have we ever looked at it to determine why maybe minorities or other, you know, why they struggle with that test?
Well, Houston, you guys aren't even using an entry-level exam anymore, right, Doug? Y'all do the recruiting.
They still take the civil service exam. It's in the academy, so they're coached up for it before they. We never have anybody fill the civil service exam.
For the
Okay.
other 75 cities in the state of Texas that have adopted Chapter 143, the exam is reviewed on a regular basis by the Civil Service Commission, which is 3 citizens appointed by the city manager, approved by the city council, and they're the ones that try to make sure that test is up to date. There are a number of court cases over the years that have dealt with how to improve civil service exams to make sure that they're not culturally biased. There's actually been departments placed under consent decrees and federal court orders about the way that they construct their civil service exams. So there's been a lot of improvements, a lot of work along those lines. And the exams typically tend to try to measure your not basically your intelligence quotient, but your common sense, your good, you know, basic sound judgment is what you're looking for more than anything else in a civil service exam.
But the problem with that, and this is just me personally, when you're looking at common sense, and I look at this, when I was in law school, I was a non-traditional law student. So my common sense, my life, my background was a little bit different than someone, because I was in law school at the age of 30, right? Because I was working full time and I had a child. And so some of the scenarios that were presented, the person sitting next to me, fresh out of, college, 21, 22, may have a different common sense view than someone such as myself with a different background. So sometimes the way that we look at things from a common sense perspective will produce different answers. And I think that could be something that could create cultural bias or a problem.
It could, and like I said, that's why there have been any number of cases out there or they've been examined and re-examined, and typically these cities hire professional, hire companies that do this for a living to help them create these exams to avoid those type of scenarios. So I really, in all honesty, I don't think the exams are the bigger part of our recruiting issues these days. I think it's who's applying to take the test that is a much, much bigger issue for us.
I think another thing that could be helpful, and we did it in high school, and it's kind of an exchange program. Maybe some of the officers in Houston need to go to some of the other places, and you can exchange them throughout, so that you can have the ability to see the differences amongst Houston and Harris County and Abilene. And I don't know, again, I know it takes money, time, and effort, but there is some rationale to get an exchange in that regard.
As long as we don't have to go to Dallas, I don't care.
Hey, watch it. One more question, because I know that our time is getting kind of close here. With respect to leadership, because that's a question that comes up a lot with the representation of African Americans or even Hispanics and women in leadership positions within law enforcement. How do we change that narrative? I mean, we saw Chief of the Police Chief Renee Hall come in from Dallas from outside. I think some people had high hopes. You had others that were kind of, still on the fence about it, but whatever, she came here. And she's already resigning after 2 years. And so with that being taken into consideration, and just in general, how do we recruit and bring in diverse leadership and keep them?
Good question. One, you have to support your command staff, and your command staff have to support your officers. If we don't have that trust in our leadership, it doesn't matter what color they are, it ain't gonna work. So we have to build trust that, and this is from a personal note, I think you need to go from within when you're dealing with large city police departments. You can't tell me that Dallas does not have someone proper in the ranks to fill the position of the chief. You just can't. I'm sorry. They're a very diverse, they're not as diverse as we are, but they're a diverse department. And it doesn't matter personally, I don't think it should matter the color of the chief, as long as he does the right thing by the command staff, by the commanders and the civil service ranks that are there. You take the best person for the job, no matter who that might be. And I think that most large departments should be going from within. Not, you have issues every time you go outside your agency. You just will. You're going to have trouble with buy-in from whoever comes in here. We've seen it here in Houston with Harold Hurt. We've seen it with Acevedo to some extent. And trust me, I like Acevedo. I don't like all his decisions, but that's why we exist. That's why a union exists. We can have our differences. We deal with it however we need to deal with it. But for other departments, that's where I think you get a little issues when you're going outside of the department just for diversity's sake. You need to pick the best person for the job. And I think inside the departments is where you need to look.
And I'll take that a step further. I think departments need to do a much better job of training up and developing that next generation of leadership. I think we need to adopt organizational cultures that say we are going to make sure that we are 2, 3, 4, layers deep at every position, just like you do on a football team. When Dak Prescott went down, the Cowboys had a seasoned veteran quarterback ready to step in and take over. police departments need to get into the mentality of doing the same thing. I think city managers and city councils become enamored with this concept of let's do a nationwide search and bring in somebody from somewhere. And Nikki, you pointed it out several times. Having somebody who understands the community, having somebody who knows the people that you're policing is as important as anything else law enforcement does. So developing that talent, in-house. And I will say this, and a bunch of my friends who are chiefs of police are going to get upset with me, but too often our leaders are too concerned that the people below them are going to replace them someday, and they see them as threats and not as assets. And we got to get past that mentality. We have to see all of our subordinates, all of our reports as our best assets, as our future leadership. So I don't know that the question is that we need to develop the leadership. The diversity will follow.
Yes, I agree with that.
That's an interesting. That's an interesting way to say that. Develop the leadership, and the diversity will follow. I think that we're on the same page.
If we can find a way to do a better job of actively recruiting more representative population into law enforcement, and then we train up all of those folks, and we do everything we can to identify the future leadership and give them the tool set and the training and the motivation that they need to work their way up through the ranks, I think we're all better off. But
I do. Yeah.
Project.
No, I agree with you on that.
One of the things we have in Houston, we have chief, we have 2 executive assistant chiefs. One's African-American, one's Caucasian. I would turn this department over to either one of those guys at any time because they've been trained up. They're ready to roll. They can step in at any time. And then the assistant chiefs, we got a handful of those that I can see someday being leaders in this department or another one.
And Doug, I'm going to help you out here. I can point to at least a half a dozen departments in the state of Texas right now who are being run, who have chiefs that are former assistant chiefs and deputy chiefs from the Houston Police Department. Why weren't they promoted from within? Same thing with Dallas. A lot of talent has been developed in those 2 departments that is then has moved on to other departments because they're not getting the opportunities. And Dallas and Houston keep focusing on going outside the department to bring in somebody. And I don't understand it. There's a lot of really good men and women in those departments that could become really good chiefs of police.
Yep.
And so that's something that we as citizens can definitely take up with the city manager. Would you agree with that? Because they are I know here in Fort Worth, they're doing the search, and we've met with our city manager and also our mayor and expressed some of the concerns. Ed Cross is retiring. And so I know that we've expressed,
If they'll
do what now?
If they'll ask their union leaders amongst our current command staff, who do you guys believe, who would you run through a brick wall for? They'll get a very good short list of names.
Right. And that was one of the questions, because what happens is you get these searches and then they start kind of casting this wide net, bringing in people from outside of the state. I do think it's more effective to bring in someone that has been within. So me and you are on the same page, Kevin, and also Doug, someone that has already kind of been there, that knows the police force. I think when you bring an outside, it's almost like if I'm a manager at a big corporation and I've been the second in charge, right, underneath the director, and I've done all this work, and then the CEO steps down, and then you go all the way outside and hire a different CEO and don't consider any of the people that have kind of helped build up that brand and help build up those relationships. And so what happens is you bring in the new police chief who now has to get to know the community, has to get to know their officers, has to get to know the culture in that police department. And I can see create, I don't want to call it hostile, but it creates a gap in where you can go and what you have to do to build up first to get there. If that makes sense.
This is part of the problem. You've got chiefs that want to come in, and every time you get a new chief, we're going to change the culture. You don't need to change the culture. You need to go out there and lead by example. It's not rocket science. You go out there and lead by example, you're going to have the troops on doing whatever you ask them to do. Hey, look, the best supervisor I ever had used to come to me and go, "Hey, look, guys, this new policy is going to suck, but we got to do it." Okay, we got buy-in in. We know, hey, we hate it, We all hate change, but then we're going to move on and go with it. You got to have somebody that can motivate. Too many times we come in there and they put the hammer on people instead of motivating them to do this job. And I've got, that's since I come on almost 30 years ago now, that's what every department to me has lacked. We get out there and we talk about what we should do, but we don't motivate our guys to do it the right way. Instead, we get on them and hammer them every time they make a mistake. But you know what? This is a human job. We're going to make human mistakes. Train them up. Teach them to do it the right way. Then you don't have this issue down the road. My 2 cents.
Nope. That's worth 5 cents, actually.
Thank you.
I think this is I'm going to look at those cases though, that Kevin mentioned with respect to the civil service test, because maybe that's an area, especially as we see more and more people disgruntled with the recruitment, and maybe that's somewhere to start to see what's happened in the past. So because that precedent has been started, so that's good information to have, and just to kind of follow up for anybody listening, to follow up with your city to see how what their those reviews are. That's good information.
I think the real thing is to increase the minority pool. How do you increase the minority pool? Because if you're having this stigma that cops and 5-0 are just
Steven, not to cut you off, but I mean that's what we're talking. I mean, in all sincerity, you just got to start the youth. You got to start it from a young age. You got to make sure they're cognizant and they work from that, because that's where it comes from. I mean, and then we got to have an honest discussion regarding our communities. One of the things that we've talked about is the dearth of teachers, African American teachers, particularly male teachers. But how often are we saying in our communities, you need to grow up to be a teacher? So how often in our communities are we saying grow up to be an officer? We usually say grow up to be a doctor, you become a lawyer, an engineer, something like that as well. So or
an athlete. And people buy into that, and that's where they go.
Yeah, but this goes back to, I wish Fred was on here. We'll make sure we bring this up when Fred gets back here next week. But this is why community policing is so important. He's like, hey, listen, if we don't have the budget, it's the first thing to go. But and I get what he wants with core services, but that has to be a core function, because you've got to, particularly we're in a death spiral regarding law enforcement recruitment right now. We cannot, as you said, when you talked about it, Kevin, when you said that we had the same number of officers since, I think you said 1990 or something insane like that.
For us, since 98, we have the same number today.
Yeah, since 1998. We that's unsustainable. So we've got to go ahead and get into start doing it. Just like the same thing happened with the legal community regarding, hey, listen, we just don't have attorneys of color, females coming in here as well. In 1990, they're like, screw it. We're going to create the African American lawyer section of the state bar. We're going to start speaking to these women. We're going to start recruiting, start going hard at this, because it's an unsustainable model. And that's what we need to do here. But they need to hear it from y'all. They don't need to hear it from us, because that's great as this lawyer saying that, but when they hear it, when Officer Griffin comes to my school and says, hey, listen, this is something that you can do. I've had a 30-year career. It's been absolutely amazing. You can do all these things, take care of your family, take care of your community right here as well. That's where they get it. When my kids get that little sticker, that says Pflugerville Police Department, they're able to have that shield and everything else from there as well. And they know the positive interactions and everything else from there. That makes a difference. My 7-year-old said something the other day about, oh, isn't that Officer Dan over there talking to that person? And someone had been stopped. And I was like, yeah, that's Officer Dan. It makes a difference, and it sucks because, just like you said, we have a finite amount of resources. So if we're serious about this, and as we already said, that they already had cut budget regarding, I think, state troopers before. The legislatures have to be serious about it. Let's see if it happens.
Yep, I agree.
Oh, I guess we're up against our deadline.
No, this is great.
Yeah.
And again, we don't want to, especially when we're talking specifics. I think Nikki is absolutely correct. You need to ensure that we get the cases vetted properly. We want the discussion not to be half-hearted or speculative when we talk about specifics. I think Kevin and I talked about that 3 months ago, and it was very pointed, because we're going to have variations of perspective, and we don't want to do it in cases that we don't even have the first sense impression from the real attorneys on the cases or investigators that are unfolding and unraveling facts that will be used to determine, the outcomes. So we're looking for ones that can give us perspective on both sides of issues, where there are proper and procedures were followed, and here's the outcome. And then ones where we're going to have questions, and we're going to definitely have discussion and debate. So until we get that, and we give at least the few days notice before Wednesday, there are other things that are coming up, and there have been, I think, issues, and then other points from, like the Black chiefs of staff and different things like that can be addressed until we get set on those cases. I think it's important, and we've both noted on either side that these cases do spark the interest at the very least, and they've caused civil unrest. So if we're going to discuss them, then we need to have time to vet them, and then also make sure that the facts that we will discuss have definitely been noted properly. All right.
Awesome. I appreciate you guys meeting every week.
I do want to say this, because we've gone now, and Kevin, I can get with you on this, is, and I mentioned this to Nikki and Rudy, that there have been things that have certainly been agreed upon by both sides that we could probably now list that, could be, even if there's 6, 7 items, that there's no doubt either they need to be mentioned as already in effect, or things that we have wholeheartedly agreed upon. We should probably be making that list, because, come November, December, I think that would be a good time to say, just through the Facebook Lives and having the interaction, clearly here's a handful or so of things that we
Areas
think,
that could be.
that no one's going to give any pushback on either side, for the legislature to consider and what they're doing, because we do know that there's going to be legislation that moves, and why not have this included in some type of form or fashion that moves our state ahead.
Hey, let me
ready.
give y'all guys a little piece of information real quick. We have a mayor's task force on, see how they put it, the mayor's task force on policing reform here in Houston. If you get a chance, pull that up and take a look at it. I found it kind of entertaining to read, talking about how systemically racist we are and all this other stuff. But when you started looking at all the proposals that they had, 95% of them, or actually probably closer to 98%, are things the city can do right now. They were talking about how the meat and fur is the
Awesome.
problem. 98% of it can already be done with no meat and fur, no nothing. It's just the city can do it. They just choose not to.
And what was that again, Doug?
So if y'all, it's called
What was that again?
City of Houston Mayor's Task Force on Task Force on Policing Reform in Houston. They
Let me
just
take a
posted it last Wednesday.
Take a guess. The ones that they could do right now, but they haven't done, are probably because of money.
Yep.
Okay.
Most of them. That's what it is. So, but there's
Perfect.
probably 2 or 3 that center around 143 protections that they want to get changed. And again, that's something that we've discussed on here before, but we may discuss again if y'all want to take a look at that. So.
I will. That's a good one. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
I know that. I think that was our first conversation, because we get a lot of discussion about that. Hey, and week.
All right.
Bye.
Yeah, appreciate it. This concludes October
Have a great
14th.
week. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.